hosting me today. I'm really excited to talk to you all about beneficial insects and creating habitat. This is in particular in support of a program, which I'll be explaining a little bit more about, that's more geared for livestock farms. But if you're here and you are not a livestock producer, that's perfectly okay as well. There's a lot of broadly applicable information regarding habitat design in this presentation. So hopefully everyone can get a little something out of it. So like Jael said, I am a pollinator conservation specialist as well as a partner biologist with the USDA NRCS. So what all of that means is basically I just help private land managers, mainly livestock farmers, create or protect habitat for beneficial insects. My role is a small part of a much bigger project, this New England Regional Conservation Partnership Program with partners like American Farmland Trust, White River NRCD, Wyndham NRCD, UVM, and all partners throughout the Connecticut River Valley watershed that are dedicated to improving the health of this watershed by supporting practices on livestock farms that help sustain and maintain production, as well as improve water quality, wildlife habitat, climate adaptation, soil health. All of these sorts of factors that we're looking to both increase resiliency and health in environmental and agricultural ecosystems. So one part of this project that I'll be highlighting today is a program in collaboration with the White River NRCD to provide livestock producers in counties within the Connecticut River watershed with free trees and shrubs. So creating habitat for wildlife in particular can be quite expensive. So to help interested farmers that maybe have interest in conservation or pollinators or maybe are just interested in other ways of creating habitat that have production value, we put together a program that will provide those beneficial pollinator trees and shrubs, as well as plant protection materials like tree tubes and mulch for livestock producers at no cost. So this program is has a particular focus on a lot of agroforestry practices. Agroforestry being the intentional integration of trees and shrubs into crop and animal farming systems, with the goal of, sort of reaping those environmental, economic, and social benefits from these types of plantings. And there's a lot of increasing interest in agroforestry in the Northeast, but I think that can be very overwhelming to know where to start, or, farms can feel pressure for the financial investment that it might take to adopt some of these practices and the sort of, feelings of uncertainty about when or if you'll see returns on these investments. So this program provides planning support by staff at White River NRCD as well as Xerces for agroforestry practices and designs like hedgerows, windbreaks, riparian buffers, and silvopasture. So these planners can help you decide, what locations might be suitable for these practices, what the designs look like, what species are integrated, and then how to merge those conservation and production goals together. And then with a plan in place, we have those trees and shrubs available that we put into those designs that these farmers can receive at no cost that are suited to help you implement the recommended practices. So White River and Xerces put together a list of species to offer farmers this spring, 2026, that have clear wildlife and production benefits. So this could entail incorporating like a native tree like basswood into a silvopastoral system. So like basswood as an example, one of the highest quantities of nectar per square foot out of any plant in the Northeast. If you've ever seen it bloom, like you'll see just it buzzing in pollinator activity. But then from the production side, it's also a really fast growing shade tree. So you can integrate it into your pastures and sort of get that shade benefit pretty quick. It can also be used as leaf fodder or even be coppiced for wood products. So, the intention of this program is to put together these designs that merge those wildlife and production goals, create perennial habitat, and allow farmers to adopt these beneficial practices, ideally with reduced financial risk. Um, so we'll go on in detail about like example designs and species and how to implement successful plantings. But I'm going to back up now and focus on why exactly we're even talking about insect conservation in the first place. So, in case you're not familiar with the Xerces Society, the organization that I work for, we're a nonprofit entirely dedicated to the conservation of invertebrates, invertebrates being any organism without a backbone, but we mostly focus on insects at Xerces. So, why do we pay so much attention to insects? This is because insects are really critical components to a healthy landscape. They help break down organic matter, they keep pest populations in check, they're at the base of the food web, supporting numerous other wildlife groups. They aid in seed dispersal, water filtration, and of course, pollination of crops and wildflowers. And in total, the estimated value of these ecosystem services in the US is about $57 billion per year. And pastures are no exception in relying on insects for health and resiliency. Beneficial insects are any insect that provide a positive ecosystem service. And in pastures, that might look like predatory flies or beetles or parasitoid wasps that help control pest populations, like face flies or horn flies. Or decomposers are another beneficial insect group, like dung beetles, which help break down dung pats, recycle nutrients, and aerate the soil. And then pollinators as well. They're also a beneficial insect group, and they help us, of course, maintain healthy, both natural plant communities as well as sustain production through, fruit and nut production in cropping systems. So we depend on insects for these beneficial ecosystem service that are the backbone of many habitats. But unfortunately, worldwide, we're seeing very concerning declines in certain insect species and groups. So, as an example, about 1 in 6 of the assessed dragonfly and damselfly species and 1 in 3 of the assessed firefly species are at risk of extinction. And in the loss of the populations, we lose out on those ecosystem services. So, like in the case of dragonflies, for instance, they're tremendously efficient aerial predators of disease-transmitting flies like mosquitoes. So, if we see those declines in both abundance of insects and diversity of insects, the question is, how do those ecosystem services persist, if at all? And Vermont is no less immune to these declines, with over half of our bumblebee species either extirpated, critically imperiled, or vulnerable. 30% of our native bees as well are either critically imperiled or imperiled. And more so than not, there's a lot more out there that we just don't know because a lot of groups just haven't received, much attention. But these groups that we have, sufficient data to understand how their populations are faring, it's generally not looking wonderful. And what's causing these declines? This is usually a combination of multiple factors. My somebody I used to work with termed it as death by 1,000 cuts, where it's, climate change, habitat loss, things like introduced pathogens, pesticides, and how all of these factors interact. It can be really difficult to disentangle and pinpoint or blame, one source. Um, so this makes conservation somewhat challenging, but I don't think, unfortunately, we can afford the complication really as much of a deterrence. And we do have a lot of knowledge and resources at the ready to help us make informed management decisions despite all this complexity. One of those resources being programs like this, or, in my organization at Xerces, we have the partner biologist position, which are entomologists that help, plan practices to promote insect populations and disentangle, site by site, all the different considerations that might go into insect conservation. And in this puzzle, pastures and rangeland are a really important piece for helping insect populations. Grazing land can provide diverse perennial plant communities, nesting and overwintering resources for insects like bumblebees, nutrient-rich soil for a wide array of beneficial soil invertebrates. But grazing land can also be detrimental to populations, depending on the management. So, like overgrazing can reduce, soil and plant community health. Beneficial insects like dung beetles can be exposed to pesticides applied to livestock, and there's ways to mitigate these threats. Um, but importantly, though, it's not just one or the other. I feel like um, sometimes people think of conservation and production as not like sort of mutually exclusive, but they're closely tied together. So it's really important that we better integrate conservation and production goals into how we're thinking about our landscapes, so we can sustain production to feed a growing human population in a way that will optimize environmental health, which helps us achieve human health, human livelihoods, and overall the resiliency of our agricultural systems. Quick note about this beautiful illustration by one of our illustrators at Xerces, Maya. This is a rangeland specific diagram, but I just couldn't avoid putting it in. And kind of captures some of the different benefits, even in pastures in the Northeast. But at the top of this presentation, I also want to kind of provide some clarity on this program, because we're offering farmers with free trees and shrubs of pollinator value. But that's not to say that early successional habitat, like, open grasslands, sunny pastures, aren't really important to also maintain. They have really tremendous conservation value, especially now when, from a wildlife perspective, at the very least, a lot of our at-risk species are early successional habitat specialists. So the regal fritillary or the bobolink that like these sunny, open environments. But that being said, there's also tremendous conservation value in high quality perennial woody planting. So this is all to say that there's not one size fits all, especially when it comes to conservation and production goals. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking a lot about the value of woody species. But that's not to say that, open pasture grasslands have no value. It's quite the opposite. They need to be protected and well managed, for conservation. And it all comes down to like what makes sense for your property individually. And that's where the personal planning comes in. So pastures, like any ecosystem, are composed of interactions between non-living factors like sunlight and water, and living factors like animals and plants. And it's the interactions between all these factors that create wildlife habitat, sequester carbon, filter water, and provide rich soil communities. But often we get these healthy and productive systems when we're supporting biodiversity in particular. Diversity overall in an ecosystem is really critical for resiliency. It's kind of like this insurance policy that in a constantly changing world, the ecosystem and the ecosystem functioning that it provides can persist. So like if we depend on one species of bee to do all of our pollination, and then that species suffers some catastrophic loss, like say a new disease enters the population, then our whole system is under threat. So in particular, the pollination part of that system. So if we have a diversity of bees, though, the loss of one doesn't mean ecosystem collapse. It means that there's other species that can maybe fill a similar ecological role and make sure those pollination services will be able to persist. So biodiversity benefits production as well. In the Northeast, I like to use dung beetles as an example. We have two groups of dung beetles here, classified as either dwellers or tunnelers. The dwellers reside within a dung pat, while the tunnelers bring the dung down into the soil. Both are really critical for maintaining productive pastures, increasing, nutrient cycling, soil aeration. But tunnelers are really important for eliminating dung and incorporating the nutrients into the soil. And then at a small scale, aerating the soil, reducing compaction, increasing water infiltration. So having these multiple functions within this like diversity of dung beetle species is important for breaking down a dung pat efficiently. So a diversity of dung beetle species enhances dung removal and nutrient cycling in this case. But in a low diversity system, say like a monoculture of a certain plant species, we see some impairments in ecosystem functioning. So we might see slow rates of decomposition, soil health issues, pest and parasite abundance, and of course, you know, the species that are present in the landscape are not the only thing attributing to this, but also how we manage the landscape. But kind of focusing on the plant diversity aspect in particular, plant diversity maintains rich, healthy soils. It can form, a dynamic community that changes over the season and provides resources continuously. From the decomposer side of things, we need a diverse community of decomposers to remove dung, aerate the soil, and bring nutrients into the soil. And then pollinators, a diverse array of pollinators to help sustain forage diversity, like clovers and other legumes, or even other wildflowers if that's of interest. So less diversity means fewer resources, which often leads to the need for intervention to make the system keep functioning. So like we might need fertilizers to maintain rich soils, or we might need pesticides to help control pest and parasite populations. In the case if you have reduced predator and parasitoid, diversity that's helping to control those outbreaks in the first place. So, a way to achieve this diversity is starting from the ground up, if not managing existing habitat. So, thinking about your plants and ultimately your soil. Creating or protecting habitat is one of the best things that we can do for beneficial insect conservation. And this can have production benefits as well. So this is a really neat recent study that did a cost analysis of buffers in regards to the ecosystem services, particularly from pollinators. So riparian buffers are these strips of vegetation along waterways could actually be tied to increased yields on pollinator-dependent crops by providing wildlife habitat for pollinators, which increased pollinator population and pollination rates, and thus yields for pollinator-dependent crops. This had an interesting caveat, though, that the smaller buffer, in this case, 30 meters, had a greater economic benefit than the 100-meter buffer because the 100-meter buffer was associated with a greater encroachment and thus loss of cropland. So I feel like this comes up a lot because we generally recommend wider buffers for water quality, and for wildlife habitat, which is super important. But we also have to be thinking about production goals and how to integrate both so that, conservation and production find those win-win situations for immediate and long-term economic viability of farming operations, as well as the long-term management of healthy ecosystems. Okay, so that was kind of my justification for insects. I hope that was convincing. Now let's dive in to how exactly do we support these populations and what do we need to be thinking about? So, as I've said probably a couple times right now, but insect diversity relies on resource diversity. Some insects are going to need shady habitats of trees and shrubs. Some might feed on other insects. Some might feed on resins from trees or pollen from trees. Some might nest in logs. Some might need sunny habitats or bare patches of soil for their nests. There's just like a huge array of resources that insects may be utilizing. And there's really no one size fits all when it comes to like benefiting insect populations like only wildflower meadows are the only way to do that. That's just not true. And especially in New England, we have a lot of forest adapted species that really relied on shaded habitats, woody habitats for resources. So we can break all of this down into three fundamental needs that are not too different from our own needs as humans. So that's food, shelter, and protection. Protection being from things like pesticides and severe repeated habitat disturbance, which I'm not going to spend too much today talking about, but will be kind of integrated into some later sections. But importantly, what qualifies in each of these categories will depend on the group and species of insect that you're looking to protect. So, for food, as an example, some insects are going to need nectar and pollen. Some need host plants, like caterpillars. Some need other insects to predate upon. Others need dung. And these food requirements might change throughout an insect's life cycle. So, like the caterpillar from the monarch butterfly, as an example, needs milkweed, but the adults need nectar. And often they might need nectar that goes far beyond when milkweed's in flowers. So, they usually need nectar resources later on into the fall when they're starting to migrate. Most of our insect populations are not migratory like the monarch butterfly, so we also have to be thinking about where they go when they overwinter or when they nest in other parts of the season. So this often is in areas like soil, leaf litter, dead or decaying wood, stems, and bark. Um, so all of these things are just kind of zoomed out examples of some of these resources. We're going to mainly focus on resources for pollinators today, but I'll slip in a bit of the other beneficial insect groups like predators and parasitoids of pests and decomposers as well. And fortunately, pollinator conservation lends well to the conservation of so many other groups because usually when you're creating habitat, for pollinators, you're supporting numerous other wildlife groups, including natural enemies of pests, which often have similar resource requirements. So the first basic principle to creating habitat is to prioritize native perennial plants. This is important because one, we want native species predominantly that our native pollinators are co-evolved with, that have been in the landscape and that they have adapted to utilize and rely on for their nutritional needs, and also have matched phenology or timing of when they emerge and when these flowering resources are present. And then two, perennial habitat is long-lived and provides reliable resources for pollinators to keep coming back to. Perennial being long-lived and annual being, more temporary. Another consideration is that often our native species are kind of coexisting more so in a polyculture because they're mutually or at least somewhat mutually competitive. That can be a little bit nuanced, but a lot of the invasive species that, in this example, like along riparian buffers with Japanese knotweed, you just see them form monocultures where few other resources are able to compete with them. And in the case of Japanese knotweed, you have this monoculture of a low value resource for pollinators, despite all the activity that, people see on knotweed. And I know beekeepers do like knotweed as a for honey, but for the native pollinators in general, it's not a valuable resource. So pollinators as a group, this is like, we have some species that emerge in the spring, some species emerge in the fall, some species that are active throughout the entire growing season. So with all of this activity, they as a group are active throughout this entire growing season. So to support residential, diverse populations, an essential design consideration within habitat that we're creating is to provide a succession of pollen and nectar resources from early spring to late fall. This is a cool diagram. Each line shows the activity of an individual native bee species in kind of like these brief windows of activity. they spend much of their life cycle below ground, and then as adults, they emerge and they're foraging resources to rear their young. So you can see that all of these native bees have different activity periods and might be relying on different resources within those activity periods. So, like a lot of our woody species, like willows or serviceberries, are the first to bloom in the spring. This also includes wind pollinated trees like hickories and oaks, which usually aren't necessarily thought of as high quality pollinator resources, but a lot of our early spring emerging bees, like native mining bees, are really using those as the bulk of their pollen resources to rear their young on. And then as trees leaf out, a lot of that bloom sort of transfers to that open, sunny habitat, that early successional habitat like meadows, and activity peaks on herbaceous resources instead. So it's really valuable within our landscape to have areas of both habitat types to extend that bloom period as long as possible. And most bees and other pollinators can't consume any flower that they want. Many of our pollinators, including the majority of our native bees, about 25% or so, are specialists. And specialization exists on a spectrum. So, generalist species are species that utilize resources from many unrelated plants, like bumblebees. You'll basically see them on anything that they can get their tongue into. They really don't have high standards. And there's other species that have, a lot more particular tastes. They might be looking for species from like one family or related genre to utilizing, only a single species or genus for resources. At the top there is the niticulate longhorn bee, which exclusively collects ironweed pollen to rear their young. So if you have ironweed as an example, which is a wet-loving herbaceous plant, it's typical that you'll see this bee there, but say you disturb that ironweed in the period of in the small period in which it flowers, that bee can't go to any other resource to rear its young on successfully. So because of this, specialists are often more vulnerable to habitat loss or reductions in plant diversity. So it's really key to support, pollinator specialists by providing a diversity of native flora resources that they have co-evolved relationships with. And this is maybe a little past what you might do personally planning, but I think the best way to go about optimizing design for the greatest number of specialists is just to integrate a high level of family diversity. So like say like oaks are in a separate family from that of willows or elms and those sorts of things. So the more family level diversity, the more likely you're supporting a greatest number of insects with these degrees of specialization. So we have, I think, 352 native bees in Vermont, last I checked, most of which are solitary. So quite different from the European honeybee, which is introduced eusocial, very different from the native bees that I'm talking about here. So they're solitary. They're usually collecting pollen to rear, their young on, and they're the exclusive workers that are doing all of the work to create the next generation. These native bees are perhaps, I think people can confidently assume that they're our chief pollinators. And part of this is because of a behavior that they exhibit called flower constancy. So this is essentially that a bee learns how to extract pollen from a particular type of flower very efficiently. And then they'll continue going back to that same type of flower instead of trying to learn how to get pollen out of a different type of flower. So not most pollinators don't do this. They just go to, whatever they can get a resource from, and they're not necessarily doing this efficient foraging. But this behavior is really helpful for these female bees trying to provision as many larvae as possible. Like I said, they're solitary, so they're the exclusive workers doing this for rearing their young. But it's also great for pollination because they're bringing the same species of pollen onto plants that they're visiting, which is actually pollinating them instead of, depositing that pollen from another unrelated plant species. Um, But this is important to understand because, from a habitat design perspective, we often advocate for planting in groups or clusters of the same species to create these continuous foraging opportunities. So, like, instead of alternating between different species or separating, species far away from, like species, it's good to like create clusters of like three or four of the same type to kind of aid in this foraging efficiency. So as I think talked about a couple slides ago, life stages can have functionally different roles in an ecosystem, as well as vastly different habitat needs. So I want to explain this a little bit in more detail, particularly with parasitoid wasps, because I think that has a lot of potential benefits in livestock operations. So parasitoids are any organism that inject their eggs into a host, and this egg hatches, and the larva is reared on that host. So most parasitoids are specialists, so they have select hosts that they parasitize, and parasitoid wasps in particular are some of the most diverse parasitoids out there, but there's also many parasitoid flies as well. And it's suspected that every insect species has at least one parasitoid that feeds on it. They're very tiny. When I say wasp, people are usually imagining large wasps like paper wasps or something, but these are, you probably wouldn't even, if you saw one like on a flower or something, you wouldn't even recognize it as a wasp. Many of them can kind of look almost ant-like in a way, but very tiny and, in general are very selective of their prey and what life stage they're looking for. What's pictured here is a species that's a common biocontrol agent. So this insect that's released, particularly in barns for helping with stable and housefly control. And so this species, when the conditions are right, can parasitize about 13 housefly pupae per day, and that's one individual, and then 100 fly pupa throughout her entire lifespan. So they're really effective at fly control. The adults are also feeding on the body fluids of the fly pupa. So, like pictured here is a female piercing the fly pupa to inject her egg, but they will also feed on the liquid contents that come out after stinging the fly pupa, which also helps kill the developing fly. So, um, this is the body fluid of the fly pupa is their primary diet. Of the adults, but they often benefit from supplemental sugar sources as well. So this is true for a lot of different parasitoids, a lot of native parasitoids that would be out in pastures, parasitizing, pest fly populations as an example. A lot of them also rely on some sugary content, nectar resources in particular, that help increase longevity. As I mentioned, a lot of them are quite small, so they can't just utilize any old nectar resource. So, like, they're not usually going to be able to access like clovers or anything like that. They need smaller, shallower flora resources like golden Alexander, pictured here. So we can be very intentional about what species we're adding into a planting. If attracting natural enemies for pest control is a priority. A lot of these natural enemies, not just parasitoid wasps, are smaller, so they need those small, shallow floral resources like meadowsweet, this small shrub pictured here, or milkweed, as well as another great one. Plants in the carrot family in particular have like these large flat inflorescences with many small open flowers that are highly, highly attractive for natural enemies. And then we also have shrubs like elderberry or forbs like partridge pea, which have what are called extrafloral nectaries, which are specialized glands along stems or other parts of the foliage that produce these sugary secretions, nectar-like secretions that are really attractive for small wasps and predatory flies and beetles. Okay, transitioning beyond the sort of sugary nectar and nectar resources and then pollen resources for protein, but butterfly and moth caterpillars, feed and develop on host plants before transitioning into adulthood, where they're primarily feeding on those, sugary liquids, although some also feed on things like tree sap or even dung. But forbs like aster and goldenrod can be important host plants, but really it's our woody species that are carrying a sizable portion of supporting our butterfly and moth diversity. And even better, a lot of these trees and shrubs also flower, so they're providing that nectar and pollen resource potentially. So they're supporting pollinators at different stages of their life cycle. One study in the US Mid-Atlantic found that woody species supported 10 times more moth and butterfly species than herbaceous plants. So you can kind of see here some really high value resources, all of which, except for blackberry, I think, are being offered in this program and the level of butterfly and moth diversity that they support. So um, LEP is Lepidoptera, which is the order for butterflies and moths. So, like oaks, as an example, support an estimated 534 different species of butterfly and moths. Cherry supports 456 species, hickory 235, and basswood 142. So, these are really what we call sort of like keystone plants that are providing just tremendous diversity when it comes to butterflies and moths, which are, also supporting bird populations as a protein source. Okay, so the vast majority of our insects live in the landscape year round and rely on more than just food to sustain themselves. So we also need to be thinking about creating habitat that species can nest and overwinter in. Bumblebees, as an example, are one of our only native bees with a true social case system. Vermont has about 17 species of bumblebees, many of which, I think about half, have demonstrated regional declines or are extirpated, unfortunately, from our region due to things like habitat loss and pathogen spillover from managed bumblebee colonies. So why I use this beautiful diagram, because I think this is a great example of just one group of organism, but all the different areas of habitat they're using throughout their life cycle. So bumblebee queens usually hibernate under trees in the leaf litter. Then upon emerging in early spring, they're looking for cavities like abandoned rodent burrows or even stone walls in which to start their colonies and rear their first broods. The queens are often looking for nest sites, for many species at least, at the interface between fields and linear woody habitats like hedgerows or windbreaks, with one study documenting bumblebee nest densities about twice as high in these linear woody habitats when compared with grassland and fully woodland habitats. So that's just kind of a cool example of like this wide array of habitat types and how an animal is using them throughout their life stages. Um, I can't not talk about grasses just because they're a super important component that often gets neglected, that are, can be important butterfly and moth host plants, like the dusted skipper here, which is a specialist of little bluestem. Um, our bunch grasses in particular, more so than the native warm season bunch grasses like little bluestem, big bluestem, Indian grass, are really great for overwintering locations and habitat for insects like predatory ground beetles. And then, of course, these grasses have numerous benefits beyond pollinators, like deep root systems that help reduce, erosion or help water infiltrate the soil. All right. Also, for shelter and overwintering habitat is deadwood or dead and decaying wood. This is a really critical resource that supports the overwintering and nesting behavior of many species, like the common metallic green sweat bee pictured here that you often see more so on flowering resources, particularly in open sunny habitats. But they're a native solitary wood nesting bee that nests in decaying or rotting wood, usually colonizing old abandoned beetle galleries, which is pretty cool. But they have these chewing mouth parts that they take like a old beetle gallery of a wood-feeding beetle, and they chew it and sort of make these intricate structures that you can see in these diagrams here that they rear their brood in. So, about 30% of our native bees use stems and wood for nesting. These species require a little bit more of messy habitat. So standing stems, snags, logs, or stumps, often like some decomposing material. And they're requiring these cavities in plant material, like hollow stems from some forbs like these, like goldenrods, asters, sunflowers, bee balm, or shrubs like sumac and elderberry that have these hollow stems that the bees will rear their broods in chambers along the stems. An important consideration for this is leaving, if you're grazing and you have some of these species, you have some of these hollow stem species, high grazing heights are great, both for maintaining plant productivity, but also for these stem nesters, and leaving the potential habitat intact over the winter because a lot of these bees are overwintering in these standing dead stems. So we're getting to the end of this section, but just kind of in general, before we get into what sort of like habitat examples, um, with all of this, I think it's also really important to be thinking about the adaptability of these resources. So like, you know, incorporating some kind of contingency plan if you're doing a planting from scratch and incorporating species that have a wide range of tolerances or can maybe tolerate extremes to your a site, like maybe if your site is really prone to drought or something like that. Really taking that quite seriously and diversity being a sort of tool for increasing the resiliency of these plantings because say you have unexpected weather events or maybe even like hydrological changes, like incorporating adaptable species or a wide array of species ensures that like there'll be some resource that's reliable, not only for wildlife to utilize, but also to like maintain plant cover within, your desired planting area. And then zooming out, that was a lot of like very particular small scale designs is from a landscape perspective, landscape simplification. So kind of like imagine flying over, and this is hard to find, I think, in New England. We don't have as much of an issue with that, but flying over and just seeing miles and miles of cornfields or something in the Midwest is more the issue here, but landscape simplification overall reduces biodiversity, of course. So this is true for pollinators as well as other beneficial uh, insects like dung beetles who do their diversity increases with habitat diversity, which, like we talked about, can quicken rates of dung removal and ultimately the reduction of foodborne illnesses like E. coli or reduction of pest flies. Um, so ultimately, something to be thinking about is if we want to support diverse beneficial insect populations on farms, one of the best ways to go about this is creating or protecting habitat diversity. So this might include having an open pasture with a diverse community of bunch grasses that provide nesting habitat, or sun-loving flowers that provide nectar resources. It might also include an area of silvopasture with trees like oaks, willows, and hickories that provide, host plants for butterflies and moths, an early spring pollen resource for native bees, as well as nesting and overwintering habitat. Or a riparian buffer that protects our waterways from pollutants and all sorts of other benefits, creates terrestrial wildlife habitat with, say willows or buttonbush and meadowsweet, which can be important for providing reliable resources in the case of drought when maybe those upland plants aren't faring so well. So that's where you can kind of zoom out and get a broader view of the different components of your farm and how to diversify the resources while increasing that habitat diversity, which will support different communities of insects. So I do want to emphasize that selecting areas to install habitat, because that's kind of what we're focusing on here with this program, is that providing free trees and shrubs, creating new habitat, or supplementing diversity in existing habitat. But generally, we want to prioritize non-existent or poor quality habitat when possible. So like, talking about creating new areas of habitat, we don't want to necessarily like clear a healthy forest to establish and plant new plants in it, when we could prioritize other areas in our landscape where we can either extend or improve habitat, like in flow 2, or flow 3 on these diagrams. So that's not outside of the scope of this presentation. Like forests also can be managed for diversity, and that's important. But for creating new habitat through plantings in these sorts of cases, it more makes sense to sort of work off what you already have and extend those areas of existing habitat, or create new habitat in areas of poor quality. So, okay, I'm going to take a sip of water. But those are some of the major considerations, to support as much pollinator diversity as possible, as well as sort of broadly the beneficial insect diversity. And this can be accomplished on any scale, whether it's a couple square feet, maybe a single tree, or, several acres of habitat. There's really, like you do what you can. And I think that there's tremendous value in planting a single tree. So we're going to talk a little bit more about where we can put habitat, in these next couple slides. So one of the examples, is silvopasture. So if it's not obvious, trees and shrubs provide tremendously beneficial habitat for all sorts of wildlife. And really with silvopasture, the most important thing for wildlife considerations is that intentional species selection to ensure, the trees integrate in pasture maybe provide more than just shade. So we can plant species or select species that provide pollen and nectar for pollinators, host plants, or fruit and nuts for birds and mammals. So additionally, like I was talking about with the stems and bark and patches of, even decaying wood, even if it's like a single standing, dead limb or something, can also provide, really critical areas of habitat in those areas. Then you also have the shade provided from the trees that's, helping to maintain cooler temperatures, also for more sensitive forest adapted species. Um, Going back to dung beetles, some of our dung beetles, like the earth boring beetles, which are some of the native tunnelers, are more so adapted for forested habitats and, really thrive in some of those partially shaded conditions, more so than areas of open pasture. The understory as well can be another area of consideration for resources like pollinators. Of course, integrating flowering legumes have soil health benefits, protein benefits, like vetch pictured here, which, can coexist with cool season grass forage, while also providing nectar resources for a lot of generalist species, in particular like bumblebees. And then from the livestock perspective, the silvopasture can help reduce stress by providing shade, maintain moisture in periods of drought or high heat, extend the grazing season, by promoting longer growth periods of cool season grass forage, diversify forage resources through leaf fodder, or fruit and nut production, and sometimes even aid in the resiliency of animals if they're also being used for fodder. Like willows, as an example, are high in tannins and can help, with internal parasite management. Another example planting area would be like along a drainage area or riparian area. So riparian refers to places adjacent to water, and the plants in these habitat act as like a transition or buffer between the water and terrestrial habitat. So these areas are really great, opportunities for diversifying the plant community with high value native plants, with, that tolerate those sort of in between conditions like blueberry, elderberry, hickory, some of the oak species, some viburnum species, willows, goes on and on. And then they're also, like I mentioned, retaining moisture through the dry season. So that makes them a critical component of a resilient landscape, zooming out again to that broader landscape perspective of, in cases of extreme drought, those areas that maintain moisture better are going to provide more reliable resources, not only for wildlife, but potentially for livestock as well, if they're being used as occasional fodder. So the vegetation and riparian buffers also helps slow down floodwater. It absorbs runoff from, bringing the runoff into the root systems and filters out harmful contaminants like heavy metals from entering our waterways. And then, the aquatic benefits of macroinvertebrates like dragonflies, damselflies, mayflies, caddisflies utilize those resources as well, the organic matter that falls from the terrestrial habitat into the aquatic habitat for shelter and food. And this overhanging vegetation also helps lower stream temperature, providing oxygen-rich water, which supports diversity of macroinvertebrate populations, and then in turn, fish populations up and down and across the food web. There's just so many benefits to all sorts of wildlife with integrating these along any sort of water body. Then for livestock, trees and shrubs in drainage and riparian areas can also provide shady edges, of open pasture or potential fodder opportunities. They can also expand, products for us humans, like fruit and nut producing trees like elderberry, chokeberry, serviceberry, cherry, or hickory, or species that can be coppiced for wood like hazels or willows. So this is a picture from a livestock farm that recently planted some dense rows of native willow species in a drainage area. So this was a wet area of their pasture that they fenced off and just sort of did this really dense planting. Like I said, willows are high in tannins and can also be a helpful tool for internal parasite management. And these willows will also help absorb that nutrient runoff from the pasture into this drainage area by collecting that runoff into their root systems and can be clipped for tree hay in periods of drought as well. So this kind of combination of wildlife benefit and production is really exciting to me. But one thing that I think if wildlife conservation is a priority, a management consideration to maintain the health of the plants as well as to maintain reliable resources for pollinators is to vary the location and timing of disturbance to maintain plant health and productivity and ensure that at least some portion of the resource remains for wildlife to use. So like in this willow strip, as an example, like you have several butterfly and moth species that are specialists feeders of willows. So if you clip this entire willow strip and you don't space out the disturbance, like maybe in different sections, you're potentially erasing that resource in a given year for that population. So similar to the, principles of rotational grazing of just rotating that disturbance and allowing long rest and recovery periods for that tree and shrub health, so they can recover, put leaves out, and, continue maintaining healthy root systems. Oh, another consideration with this is if you're clipping for tree hay and you're planting in drainage areas, these can become like really concentrated sort of locations of phosphorus. And, of course, phosphorus, nitrogen, important in some component for water, but can be often in excessive and lead to eutrophication and poor water quality, algae blooms, those sorts of things. So if you're clipping, I always recommend to bring to an upland area to reduce, like, just maintain like a longer period of flow for those resources to be spread out, those nutrients to be spread out over the landscape so you're not leading to large amounts of nutrients enter that system once again after clipping them. Field edges as well, another marginal area that can be really great candidates for new habitat if you, are maybe working with few areas. A lot of field edges that I see go from like right from field edge to forest and lack that transitional area, which we call an ecotone. And ecotones are really important and really adaptable. You can do like a row or several rows of shorter statured trees and shrubs that soften the forest edge and can provide a tremendous benefit both to populations that are using grasslands and also forests. And then for livestock, once again, similar benefits with the intentional species selection of fodder opportunities, as well as, of course, like potential shade opportunities along the edge. Hedgerows and windbreaks are some of my favorite types of plantains. There's just a huge range of design options depending on purpose. They can be used to separate paddocks, buffer wind and snow, reduce, noise or even smell if that's a concern, provide shade, and of course, like they can be really great habitat corridors for wildlife between patches of forest. Windbreaks in particular can also provide microclimate benefits. So, like by just reducing the wind velocity, this enables pollinators to forage more efficiently and actually enhances pollination rates. So, this is pretty much true of any insect that is going to be, dispersing through flight. Wind can, of course, disperse insects quite far, quite fast, but if you're trying to maintain, populations within a given area to do some sort of service, like having that buffer wind effect can be quite helpful for aiding in that small scale dispersal. An important caveat, though, to consider with any linear planting that might act as a buffer is the same factors that make them effective buffers can also lead them to accumulate pesticides and eventually pose a danger for pollinators. This is mostly a concern for areas that may be contaminated with systemic pesticides like neonicotinoids that are taken up into plants and expressed in pollen and nectar. So early flowering tree and shrub species, as an example, we have a good amount of evidence to show that they can, in particular, become contaminated by neonicotinoids through non-target drift of treated seed coating dust during crop planting. It can also, if pesticide travels either as droplets or as dust, can contaminate the surfaces of foliage, or even throughout the entire, planting, both on the leaf surfaces, or at the leaf litter. So if this is something that you have to be thinking about, if there's some type of pesticide application nearby, like you have a corn or soybean field that you're planting with treated seed, you can plant non-flowering dense evergreens to help protect the flowering resources from those pesticides. This is There's a lot of specific design considerations with this. So I would just say that if you have any questions on this, my email will be at the end of the presentation. And please reach out and we can talk about like some of the considerations in more detail, like species, evergreen species, densities, those sorts of things. Okay. So I've sprinkled this throughout, but just wanted to highlight some of the main ways plantains can expand or improve production benefits beyond, the potential benefit to beneficial insects, which of course, as we talked about, have production benefits themselves. But, diversifying forage opportunities through leaf fodder or fruit and nut production. Some great leaf fodder trees offered in this program are poplars, willows, and basswood, mulberry as well. Other trees like honey locust can provide carbohydrate-rich pods in fall and winter, providing different sources of nutrition at different periods of time. And then second, of course, they can, in a silvopasture case or in any other case where you're creating shade opportunities, this helps reduce animal stress, promotes animal health by providing shade. And there being some evidence as well of shade potentially deterring certain pest fly groups as well, which can also relieve animal stress, particularly for hornfly populations. And then lastly, a lot of these species offered in this program also have potentially marketable products, or at the very least, products that you or your family could utilize, like nuts for food or oil, like hickories or chestnuts, fruits for jams, jellies and juices, like serviceberry, chokeberry, some blueberries, as an example, or stem cuttings for bouquets or live staking or basket weaving, or, just wood products and a wide array of different sort of quality woods that are offered in this program. Okay, so how are we doing on time? Okay,
6:31.
6:31. Okay, I want to leave a good amount for questions. So I'm gonna go through this really quick, but this is just to kind of emphasize both the ecological and production benefits of individual species. And I can share these slides out so people can take a closer look. But I really want to get to the sort of steps of creating habitat. So um, those are all the things we want to integrate and support as much pollinator diversity as possible. And there's a wide range of scales that we can accomplish this in. So to go about, where do I even start? This is where having planners, either from, organizations like White River or Xerces or even NRCS, helping to provide technical support related to planning practices that help beneficial insect populations. That's the first, recommendation that I would have. But these are kind of some of the questions to ask yourself to get you started. I'm thinking about like, where might I even establish a planting location? Like, what's important to consider? Is the site accessible? Can you get equipment out there? What are your production and conservation goals? Like, does an area of silvopasture make sense? Are you seeing like some trend in production that, a habitat planting might help solve, like a windbreak or something? What are the abiotic conditions? So what's the soil type? What sun exposure? You have what your labor capacity is. Do you have to rent equipment? And timeline as well. Like in this program, these trees and shrubs are being offered spring 2026. And so, signing up and making sure that you have the resources to get the materials in the ground. So, creating a plan, work with White River NRCD staff or myself to put together a plan for your desired planting location, coming up with quantities needed and desirable or suitable species for your site based on all of those questions. Some of those projects, like we've talked about, might be repairing buffers, hedgerows, windbreaks, silvopasture, with a wide array of what these plantings can look like. This is all subject to what's going to make sense for your site, but that's where we can provide some design examples to help you get started. But these designs all are species that are offered through the program, with different benefits. Like these are repairing buffer designs with both potentially doing a medium stature or taller stature buffer or a taller statured windbreak or shorter statured hedgerows, taller statured hedgerows, medium statured hedgerows, and then different silvopasture designs. So all of these are resources that, if you're interested in this program, that we can help you figure out and provide you some ideas to help you get started. Um, so you've selected your planting location, you've come up with a plan, you put in the order for what trees and shrubs you'll get. Once you receive your bundle of trees and shrubs that you've requested, it's important to plant immediately after delivery if possible. If temporary storage is needed, the plants can stay dormant in a cooler or walk-in refrigerator, for up to about 4 weeks. Another temporary storage method, if you don't have access to those means, is to heel in the plants, which is a practice of digging about a 6-inch deep trench and placing the seedlings in the trench for temporary storage. Um, some other pre-planting considerations would be, as you're handling and storing the plants, a really important thing is to make sure that you are keeping the top of the plants dry and free of mold, and the roots moist and cool. So really maintaining root moisture, but not that moisture up at the tops of the plants to prevent mold. Um, you don't want to plant into frozen or dry soil, so make sure planting conditions are right. Soil can be irrigated prior to planting. If you do need, if there is a dry spell, and making sure that you're following up on irrigation, which we'll talk a little bit about in the next slide. Um, and inspect the stock before planting to make sure that it hasn't developed mold or that it doesn't have, any pest before planting and sort of promoting the health of the plant that you're putting in the ground. So you have your plants. Now you have to prepare the planting area. These steps are going to be really dependent on the existing plant cover of your planting area, with the main goal here being eliminating or reducing potential competition immediately around the location in which you're installing your plants. So this might be done through like machine or hand scalping the area around the plants. Like usually we recommend at least 3 feet in diameter and about 2 to 4 inches deep. But this can really depend on what existing plant cover you're working with. Like if you are on the left here is like a dense stand of bittersweet, an invasive vine that can form really dense competitive clusters that might need a little bit more uh, pre-site prep. Um, and then once you have that area cleared, you can plant the stock in the center of the scalped area. Alternatively, if you have equipment and if you have like a lot of area to plant into, if you have like a rototiller, you can just rototill a 3 foot wide strip and place plants, at the center of the tilled area. I highly recommend that before you plant, measure and stage your plants with the appropriate spacing, with the spacing guidance. Either, we can help you at Xerces or White River if you have any questions. And then once everything is staged out, pre-drilling and digging the appropriate number of holes. And when digging those holes, it's important to make them wide and deep enough to insert roots without J-rooting, which is when the root tips get bent upwards. So like you can see on the picture to the right of a plant that has been J-rooted. And then while plants are waiting to get put into the ground, once again, make sure that you're keeping the root systems moist. The best part, at least to me, is installing plants. So you have your site prep done, you have everything staged out, and your holes dug. Now you can place the tree and shrub into the hole. It's important that you're placing it so the root crown is at ground level. I have the root crown example on this plant marked right where you see, kind of it transitioning to those stems between the roots. And once again, making sure that the root tips will not be J-rooted or that the root crown, is exposed, will not be, that the root crown is exposed above the ground without going um, beneath. Oh gosh, I got that mixed up in my head. Um, So once you have your plant in the good position, you backfill the hole to secure the plant, tamp the soil down either with, your hands or your feet to make sure that the plant is securely in the ground, and then irrigate the plant transplants really thoroughly after planting. This is really important, and we'll talk a little bit about follow-up irrigation, but generally most sites need some level of irrigation really to promote plant success. Um, then you can place and secure the tree tubes, leaving no gaps, ideally, between the bottom of the tree tube and the ground to prevent rodents from getting in and, causing damage to your newly established tree. And then mulch with untreated wood chips around the tree tube to help reduce weed competition, and retain moisture around the tree. Or shrub, I suppose. And then if you're establishing trees in a place where animals graze, another consideration is adding some fences, whether that be like a hot wire or cattle panel or some combination of deterrence structure to prevent disturbance from, during establishment. So last step, follow-up maintenance. Weed control is really critical for the first and second year after planting. This can either be done through weed whacking, mowing, grazing, as long as it's protecting, the individual tree or shrub that you're establishing. Um, I generally recommend to monitor around, once again, like a 3 foot diameter around the base of each seedling through any means that you have. This is important for preventing, things from growing too high and sort of shading out what you're trying to establish. Once again, irrigation is recommended. Newly transplanted plants, I generally recommend to receive at least 1 inch of water per week during the first 2 years of establishment. This is sort of best case scenario, and I know is not always possible, but sort of the best case for promoting plant success. And then long term, monitoring your tree tubes and repairing and replacing as needed, fencing too to protect plants from animal damage. And there's tons of helpful resources out there on actually installing the plants, planting designs, all sorts of considerations from, experts like the Savannah Institute, Interlace Commons, USDA, Forest Service, which has a great agroforestry center, and tons of university extensions as well. Here are just some examples of some of my favorite resources. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I went a little bit over. I hope that wasn't too overwhelming. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. And if something comes up later, please reach out on my email or reach out to White River as well. Yeah, we're here to answer any questions you have about the program, and I'm here to answer any questions you have about beneficial insects more broadly as well. So thank you.
If you're a livestock farmer and you're here and you want to ask any questions about the program, you can do that as well. We do provide tree tubes, weed mats, and wood chips along with the trees and shrubs to help protect the trees. I'll also add that what we mean by livestock farmer isn't just like cattle and goats or something, but it can include chickens and bees as well, I believe.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah,
Ducks.
thanks for that clarification, Jael. Yeah, it can be pretty broad. So even if you have questions about like eligibility, like definitely still look at the program. You can reach out to White River through their application portal, and we can help you, sort of discern eligibility requirements. But yeah, beekeepers are eligible too, people who have honeybees.
There is
Um,
a question in the chat. Oh, good. Do you see that,
Yeah,
Julie?
yeah. So is there a minimum requirement for number of livestock? No, not necessarily. Generally, for this program, livestock is going to be your primary product or focus for your operation. But there's not like a minimum requirement for how many you have. Addie asks if
Yeah,
yeah.
I'll send it out to everyone who registered, and we'll also post it on. We have a YouTube channel, so you can find it there as well.
Yeah. So Antoinette asks, is black elderberry as good as native elderberries? That is a great question. So a lot of the there's a lot of species that I feel like have native equivalents in the landscape that might be integrated. And for the most part, we don't have a great sense of exactly how they compare in value to native pollinators. In general, why I recommend native ideally locally or regionally native plants is because if you're selecting those species, it's basically an insurance that the native pollinators are going to get all that they can out of it. There's a lot of concerns around um, cultivars and, non-native sort of like similar species might not provide a lot of these um, benefits to pollinators that we don't have a great understanding of, like nutrition or like reproduction success. Like, are the caterpillars, as an example, like this would be one of the questions that I would ask is, are the caterpillars that are reared black elderberry, do they have the same weight gain, the same, reproductive potential? Are all of these things transferred between species? And so Yes, yeah. So yeah, like Martha said, because of these questions, we generally just advocate for the native species. And for the most part, for some of the species that we have looked at, the cultivars or the non-native species are not providing the same quality of resources. But for black elderberry in particular, I'm not entirely sure how that translates, like for butterflies and moths. Are there recommended mow times for grass/forb areas for least negative effect to beneficial species? Yeah, absolutely. So we recommend after first frost. And so generally, like we'll say like Halloween or something, because that's just easy to remember and you don't have to keep track of it. This is important. Like I talked about, insects are in our landscape year round. You can't really have a period of disturbance and not expect to have some level of disturbance on populations. But after first frost, you're at least letting everything impollinate for pollinators in particular. Everything that's flowering there has flowered and set seed. So you're helping maintain that flower diversity and abundance over time. And most insects are going to be overwintering at that stage. So the mowing could disturb those overwintering insects, but that's where despite the late mowing, you're still splitting the habitat into thirds. So, like if you have an acre of early successional habitat, you're only mowing one third in a given year and rotating that. So, year one, you mow the first one third, year two, the second one third, and year three, the third one third. And you're just basically making sure that there's an undisturbed population at all given time of disturbance that can recolonize an area. So Antoinette also asked, I have 6 goats and have been going up the hill to the edge of the woods where young white pines are growing. I am chopping them down for the goats this winter. Is this bad? Um, is this bad? That's such a, that's going to be a subjective question, I think. However, from my perspective, which is one perspective of somebody who's an entomologist and not like a forester or anything like that, is I used to manage a bunch of habitat, a bunch of early successional habitat with white pines, and those white pines, they just kept coming back. It was never really too much of a concern that I was like, I kept cutting them because I was trying to keep the area open and sunny for a butterfly species that we were trying to conserve. But yeah, so uh, I don't know if I would be too concerned about it. They're pretty resilient. Is there an average number of trees that one can expect to receive? Um, Karen and Jael, I don't know if you have, no, I don't off the top of my head have an average. Everything has been kind of site to site planning specific projects. So, uh, yeah, I think it's really variable. Like you can, if you have like a large project in mind, like still reach out, still go through the planning process, and then, through that process, I think, White River can help you understand the amount that they'll be able to provide for. But
Yeah,
yeah.
we have a lot of trees available. So definitely reach out and we can help you with your plan. I guess one thing I will add is that you do have to be in that service area
Mhm.
to participate in the program. So Julie kind of showed the map along the Connecticut River in New Hampshire and in Vermont. So if your farm is in either of those areas, you will qualify.
Yeah, sorry for the quick slides, but I'm going to go back to that map just so everyone can see it again after getting all of this information. I should have So yeah, so um, as well, if there's anybody on in Massachusetts on this call too, reach out to me directly through my email, julie.michelson@xerces.org, because we do have a different program down there that we can talk about potential resources. But yeah, unfortunately, we are constrained by counties within the Connecticut River Valley watershed. And when will the trees be available? So spring 2026. I don't know, Jael and Karen, if you have like projected dates yet, or at least like approximate week or month.
Yeah, so we were planning on April 25th doing the distribution on that day. So it kind of is dependent on one of the nurseries we're sourcing the trees from when they can dig and kind of what the spring conditions are like. But sometime in mid to late April.
Another question, are there any similar programs in Maine? Unfortunately, not that I'm aware of. However, if there is, there is so the organization that I work for, Xerces, we do have a partner biologist, a person who has a similar position to me in Maine. Her name is Erin Coca. And Tasha, if you want to reach out to me, I can connect you with her. She can, at the very least, provide planning support and help you maybe find similar programs. If there are any in Maine. But yeah, definitely you can still reach out to me and I can help connect you with what resources I know of in Maine at the very least. Yes, thank you, Jael. Oh, okay. You know Erin. Oh, wonderful. Okay. Yeah, definitely reach out to Erin. She's a wealth of knowledge for all things Maine. But yeah, this program in particular is just for Vermont, New Hampshire.
Are there any more questions? We have a few more minutes left. And please reach out if you're interested in the program and we can start the planning process. Would like to get the planning done by mid-March if possible.
Yeah. Um, Another quick aside that I'll say, beyond just the scope of this program, um, if you're interested in, like, maybe you can't accomplish this in spring 2026, still reach out to me. There's ongoing planning and financial assistance available outside of just this program for livestock operations. So there still might be future opportunities that we can just keep you in the loop for. What about hedgerows along gravel roads that are salted and dusty? That is a great question. I see that happen a lot. And that's where, I would consider some taller statured species, like maybe doing some tiers. Like sometimes I see along the roads, like there'll be like a grass layer, and those are all like coated in dust. And then like some of the taller resources are more clear of that dust exposure. Um, Salt is a good question. Effects on vertebrate insect communities, I don't know too much about. It's more the concern about runoff into aquatic ecosystems and impairments on macroinvertebrates like dragonflies, damselflies, stoneflies, that salty waters can from salt runoff can really harm. Um, but if you like have a dirt road, I would maybe consider like maybe there's still options, but selecting just maybe some taller stature trees that will be safe from that dust exposure. Because I don't have a great sense of like, I mean, I don't see too many whenever I see like a really dusty like stand of goldenrod or something like that in Vermont, like I don't see too much activity. So I imagine it's not great, but I don't like have any science to point to potential effects.
Julie and Jan.